They told you asylums were places of healing, sanctuaries for the broken mind. But what if I told you there was one asylum? A place so dark, so twisted, it wasn't built to heal at all. It was a prison of horrors, a shadow realm where human bodies were reduced to currency and the dead became food. In 1886, deep in Massachusetts, a secret unfolded in the cold corridors of an asylum that still haunts the darkest corners of history, where patients were forced to eat the flesh of the dead. This isn't just a story. It's a descent into a forbidden truth, a place where the line between victim and monster blurred, where madness wasn't just inside the mind, but etched into the very fabric of institutional cruelty. Listen closely, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just a dark chapter. It's a warning from the abyss about power, control, and the grotesque length systems will go to break the human spirit. The story begins in an era when mental illness was misunderstood and feared, and asylums were less sanctuaries and more cages. But the asylum I'm speaking of was unlike any other. Patients were disappearing, not through death alone, but through something far more sinister. There was a sinister practice hidden beneath the veil of medical care, a ghastly ritual that no history book would dare admit. Flesh eaten, bones cracked, and sanity shattered by forces masked in white coats and cold steel instruments. This was a house built on silence and suffering, where the broken were consumed, quite literally. What twisted force could orchestrate such a nightmare? How could an institution, sworn to protect, become the stage for cannibalism? This is not the rambling of lunatics or wild urban legends. This is recorded history, twisted and buried, waiting to be unearthed. And what it reveals is not just about human depravity, but about the machinery of control and corruption that thrives when darkness is allowed to reign unchecked. You are about to step through the cracks of reality, into a shadow where the truth gnaws at the edges of your soul. Welcome to Massachusetts' Asylum of Cannibals. Welcome to the nightmare they never wanted you to see. The asylum was nestled deep in the cold woods of Massachusetts, surrounded by dense fog and twisted trees. A place forgotten by time, but never by its victims. Behind its towering iron gates and stone walls, the world's cruelty hid beneath the guise of medical care. Patients arrived broken, vulnerable, and desperate for help. But what they found was a descent into a new kind of hell. The staff were not just caretakers. They were wardens of a monstrous secret. Orders came from the highest levels, whispered in locked rooms and passed through veins of power like poison. This was a place where human dignity was crushed beneath layers of systematic abuse, and where bodies became tools for survival, not of the mind, but of the institution itself. Disease and starvation ravaged the asylum's halls. Food was scarce, rations were deliberately limited, and hunger became a weapon used to break resistance. Yet the darkest horror wasn't just starvation. It was the brutal rule that the dead could not be buried in peace. Instead, their bodies were seized and butchered. The patients, the living, terrified, desperate souls, were forced to eat what remained. Flesh torn from the dead, served cold and raw, a bitter testament to the depths of human degradation. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a way to strip away the last fragments of identity and will. Cannibalism wasn't born from madness alone, it was imposed as a method of control. To eat the dead was to surrender completely, to become part of the system's monstrous cycle. You might wonder, how could this have happened under the watch of doctors and officials? Because power in this asylum wasn't about healing, it was about domination. The staff wielded hunger and fear like weapons. The patients were not seen as people, but as property, expendable and broken. The cannibalism was not a secret horror creeping from the shadows. It was institutionalized, sanctioned, and silenced through fear and complicity. Those who resisted vanished, or were locked away in isolation, their voices crushed. This was a system designed to dehumanize, to erase, to consume. But this nightmare was no accident. It was engineered, a dark experiment in control and submission, a mirror of the corrupt power structures that shape our world even today. The asylum's cannibalism is a warning, a grotesque symbol of how far institutions will go to maintain control, how they prey on the weak, and how the darkest secrets are often hidden in plain sight behind the facade of care. To understand how such horror took root, you must grasp the twisted mindset that infected the asylum's leadership. Men and women who believed that suffering was a tool to break the human spirit, to reshape it into something malleable and obedient. They didn't see patients as human beings, they were experiments, assets to be controlled, expendable pieces in a vast machine of power. Their methods were ruthless and coldly efficient. Starvation, isolation, and fear became the instruments of their control. Hunger wasn't an unfortunate circumstance. It was a weapon meticulously deployed to turn the inmates against one another, to fracture any hope of unity or rebellion. In this toxic environment, cannibalism became more than survival, it was an enforced ritual. A psychological cage as real as the iron bars outside the windows. Eating the flesh of the dead wasn't simply about nourishment, it was about submission, about stripping away a person's last vestige of humanity. The act was a daily humiliation, a brutal reminder that these souls belonged to the asylum, that their bodies were no longer theirs. The cannibalistic feast was a macabre ceremony designed to corrode sanity, to teach a savage lesson. Resistance is futile, and the institution owns you utterly, even in death. And yet, this grotesque system depended not only on cruelty but on secrecy. The asylum's leaders were masters of deception. They masked the horror behind layers of bureaucratic jargon, medical lies, and public relations fausse aides. Official records were doctored or disappeared altogether. Families of the patients were fed lies about care and progress. Whispers of the truth were dismissed as delusions, the ravings of madmen. But behind closed doors, the cannibalistic nightmare unfolded nightly, hidden from the eyes of a society too afraid or too complicit to look deeper. This horror was not an isolated anomaly, it was part of a larger pattern. Across the 19th century, institutions wielded fear and dehumanization as tools of control, from prisons to factories to asylums. The asylum's cannibalism is a grotesque, visceral metaphor for the ways systems consume the very people they claim to serve, grinding them down until they become shadows of themselves. And the question we must ask ourselves now is, how many institutions today continue to operate under the same ruthless logic, hiding cruelty beneath layers of control, silence, and denial? Inside those walls, the hierarchy was merciless and precise. The doctors, the orderlies, even the so-called caretakers. They weren't merely employees, they were enforcers of an unholy pact. Every act of cruelty was calculated, every denial of food a deliberate strike against the will. The patients became pawns in a grim game of power, caught in a spiral where survival meant submission, and resistance meant disappearance. There were no accidents here. Only cold, methodical designs to fracture the human mind until it could be reshaped, reprogrammed to serve the institution's sinister agenda. The use of cannibalism as a control mechanism reveals a deeper truth about the nature of power. It is always hungry, always seeking to consume and dominate. The act of forcing patients to eat the dead was the ultimate humiliation, a way to sever ties with dignity and selfhood. It stripped away the boundary between life and death, sanity and madness, turning the asylum into a grotesque theater where the living were made to digest the remains of their fallen comrades. It was not just physical cannibalism, it was symbolic, a devouring of identity, of resistance, of hope. And yet, in this darkest crucible there were sparks of defiance. Some patients, even under unimaginable pressure, resisted the imposed rituals. They held on to fragments of their humanity, whispering secrets in the shadows, forging silent bonds of rebellion. But these acts of resistance were met with brutal reprisals. The institution crushed them with force, isolation, or by simply erasing their existence. To speak out was to invite oblivion. To refuse to eat was to court death. What you must understand is this: the asylum's cannibalism was not madness run wild. It was an engineered system of psychological control, a mechanism of terror designed to crush not just bodies but souls. It reflects a pattern seen throughout history, where institutions weaponize suffering, break down individuals, and rebuild them as obedient cogs in a corrupt machine. The asylum is a mirror held up to the darkest recesses of organized power, revealing the grotesque cost of control when left unchecked. By 1886, the asylum had perfected its machinery of control. Hunger was no longer just a symptom of neglect. It was a deliberate policy. Each meager meal was designed to weaken the body and cloud the mind, to make the patients pliable and desperate. And when the inevitable happened, when one of them died from disease, beatings, or sheer exhaustion, the death was not mourned. It was harvested. The corpse became property, stripped of any dignity, butchered by hands that claimed to serve medicine. The flesh was distributed under the guise of nourishment, and the cycle continued. This was not chaos. It was order, a precise, institutional order born from an understanding of fear so profound that it could twist human survival into complicity. When a man is starving, his morality becomes negotiable, and the asylum's leadership knew this. They relied on it. They knew that the moment a patient crossed the line and ate, something irreversible happened inside him. Shame, revulsion, and self-disgust fused into submission. The man who once dreamed of escape or rebellion became hollow, haunted, and compliant. But there was another layer, one most people will refuse to believe. Rumors swirled among the staff that the higher, Ups believed eating human flesh could strengthen the mind of the insane, that consuming the dead would somehow bind the patients to the institution on a deeper, almost ritualistic level. This was not medicine. This was an occult idea dressed in the language of science, whispered in the shadows of medical conferences and private gatherings. To them, it was a fusion of control, superstition, and power, a belief that by consuming the dead, they were taking the first step toward erasing the self entirely. Think about what that means. This wasn't just about keeping patients alive. It was about reprogramming them. It was about turning human beings into vessels, empty shells that could be reshaped according to the will of those in charge. And once you see that, you begin to realize something far more disturbing. The asylum was never a place for healing. It was a laboratory, and the cannibalism, that was just one experiment. The first whispers came from a man named Elias Carter, a patient who had once been a schoolteacher before grief and depression had driven him into the asylum's gates. He kept his mind sharper than most, hiding his clarity behind a mask of quiet compliance. But what he witnessed would carve itself into his soul. Elias wrote his account in the margins of old hymn books, smuggled scraps of paper, even on the back of prescription slips. He knew no one would believe him. But he wrote anyway, because the truth once seen is a weight that can crush you if left unspoken. In his notes, he described a winter night when the air inside the asylum stank of boiled meat. It was not the smell of any animal he had ever known. The orderlies moved through the halls with buckets and cleavers, their faces grim but methodical. In the dining hall, the stew was ladled out. No one spoke. No one dared. Across the table, Elias watched a young woman, barely more than 20, cry silently as she lifted the spoon to her mouth. She had been in the bed next to the man who had died that morning. Elias didn't eat that night. He feigned illness, endured the beatings that came after, and locked the smell deep in his memory. But the worst part wasn't the act itself. It was the knowledge that this was routine. The staff weren't improvising. They had a system. Elias also noticed something else. Those who refused to eat would often vanish within days. Sometimes they were dragged to the basement, where the screams echoed faintly through the pipes. Sometimes their beds were simply emptied in the night, the sheets stripped, the name erased from the records. It was as if they had never existed. What Elias feared most wasn't death. It was transformation. He began to notice that those who partook in the flesh, especially those who ate more than once, became different. Their eyes dulled, their posture slackened. They no longer resisted orders. It was as though a part of them had been consumed along with the meat. This terrified Elias more than the cannibalism itself, because it meant the asylum wasn't just feeding bodies. It was feeding on identity. The deeper you look, the more you realize the cannibalism was only the surface. Beneath it ran something older, darker, an ideology that didn't begin in Massachusetts and didn't end when the asylum closed its doors. Elias' hidden writings hinted at strange symbols, carved into the basement walls, half hidden under layers of peeling paint. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, geometric, and unnervingly precise. Patterns that matched diagrams found in forbidden grimoires dating back centuries. There were whispers among the staff of a consumption rite, a belief rooted in the idea that the act of eating human flesh could transfer not just physical strength, but the very essence of the dead into the living. The orderlies laughed when they spoke of it in daylight, but in the quiet hours, Elias saw them speak in hushed voices, heads bowed, as if invoking something. This was not madness. It was a ritual repeated over and over, disguised as survival, wrapped in the language of medical necessity. The asylum's director, a man named Dr. Silas Hawthorne, was said to have been obsessed with the writings of early colonial mystics. He believed that madness was not a disease but a doorway, and that by breaking a person entirely, you could push them through that door into a higher state of being. Cannibalism, in his view, was a key, the final act of surrender, the final tearing away of self. The flesh of the dead was a bridge, he said, between the living and the unknowable. Elias described one night when the patients were herded into the basement, where the bodies of 2 men lay on stone tables. Around them, candles flickered in a pattern that matched the carvings on the walls. Hawthorne stood at the center, speaking in a voice that was calm, commanding, almost hypnotic. The orderlies cut the flesh, and the patients were made to kneel and eat while the doctor recited words in a language Elias could not recognize. This was not desperation. This was ceremony. And here's the most disturbing part. The patients who survived these rituals did not just lose their will to resist. They began to speak of visions. Shadowed figures in their rooms at night. Voices whispering secrets from the corners of the ceiling, dreams that bled into waking life. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about food. It was about opening something that should have stayed closed. Elias knew the night of the basement ritual was a turning point. Until then, he had survived by blending in, by keeping his head down, by pretending to be broken. But what he saw, the symbols, the chanting, the forced feeding, convinced him of one thing: if he stayed, he wouldn't just die, he would be erased. Not just from the asylum's records, but from himself. Whatever those rites were doing, they weren't stopping at the body. They were reaching into the mind, the soul, reshaping it into something obedient, empty, and hollow. The decision to escape came quietly, like the flicker of a candle in a dark room. He didn't dare tell anyone. Not the woman who cried into her spoon. Not the boy who still hummed lullabies to himself in the corner. The asylum had a way of finding secrets. The walls seemed to listen. The orderlies seemed to know when a man's mind was beginning to wander toward freedom. Elias began to map the place in his head. The sound of keys at certain hours, the rhythm of the night patrols, the way the fog rolled in thickest near the northern wall. He even memorized which floorboards groaned underfoot. Every detail mattered, but with each day the risks grew. Patients were vanishing faster now. The rituals were becoming more frequent, and Hawthorne's sermons about transcendence more fervent. It was as if the asylum was feeding on itself, accelerating toward some climax Elias couldn't yet understand. The night before his planned escape, something happened that nearly broke him. The young woman from the dining hall, the one who had eaten her dead friend's flesh, came to him in the shadows and whispered, "It's not just them. Once you eat, you start to want it." Her eyes were wide, glassy, as if something else was looking out from behind them. "It follows you in your dreams," she said. And then she laughed, a hollow, joyless sound, before walking away into the dark. Elias knew then that escaping the walls might not be enough. The real prison was the thing Hawthorne was planting inside people's minds. If he stayed another month, maybe another week, it would take him too. The plan was set. Tomorrow night, he would make his move, knowing that if he failed, his body might not be buried and his flesh would not be his own. The fog was so thick that night it seemed to swallow the moon. The northern wall loomed in the distance, a jagged shadow against the pale mist. Elias had timed everything. The rotation of the night watch, the moment the keys changed hands, the shift when the orderlies always lingered in the smoking room. He had no tools, only desperation, and the knowledge that staying meant becoming something less than human. He slipped from his cot without a sound, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Every step felt like a betrayal of the silence, every creak a scream in the stillness. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and something darker, older, the lingering ghost of boiled flesh. At the end of the east corridor, he passed the locked door to the basement. From behind it, faint murmurs rose, rhythmic and low, like the breathing of something vast and unseen. He didn't dare linger. The northern gate was in sight now, but the fog turned the world into a labyrinth. Elias kept to the shadows, hugging the stone walls, his fingers trailing over the rough surface to steady himself. Somewhere above, the watchman's boots scraped against the metal walkway. Elias froze, heart pounding, as the beam of a lantern swept past him and vanished into the mist. Then came the sound he dreaded. Footsteps that were too close, too purposeful. An orderly's voice cut through the fog. "Carter, where do you think you're going?" The tone wasn't angry. It was amused, as though escape was an inside joke only the asylum understood. Elias ran. The world became a blur of stone, iron, and breathless panic. Behind him, the footsteps multiplied. The fog seemed to thicken, clutching at his legs, pulling him back. He reached the wall, his hands finding the rough surface where years of erosion had made footholds. His fingers bled as he clawed upward, his breath ragged. A hand grabbed his ankle. He kicked, twisting free, scrambling until he felt the top beneath his palms. But just as he swung his leg over, a voice rose from the fog, deep, commanding, and far too close. "You can leave the walls, Elias. But you will never leave us?" He didn't look back. He dropped to the other side, hit the ground hard, and ran into the trees. The forest swallowed him whole, but the echo of that voice followed, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. Elias made it out of the woods that night, but freedom did not come with daylight. The asylum stayed with him, seeping into every shadow of his life. For months, he moved from town to town, sleeping in barns, abandoned sheds, anywhere the smell of damp earth could mask the scent of his fear. He never stayed in one place long enough to be recognized. He ate little, spoke less, and avoided the gaze of strangers. But no matter how far he ran, the asylum followed, not in flesh and bone, but in the corridors of his mind. It began with the dreams. At first, they were just fragments. The clang of the meal bell, the sound of dripping in the dark, the cold weight of a spoon in his hand. But soon the dreams became whole, pulling him back into the dining hall, forcing him to sit among the others. The faces were wrong now, distorted, swollen, their mouths too wide, their eyes dark hollows. The bowls were always full, and no matter how he pushed them away, the hands of the orderlies would press the spoon to his lips. He would wake gagging, tasting iron and salt. And then came the hunger. It was subtle at first, an aversion to normal food, a dull dissatisfaction that no bread or stew could cure. The scent of roasting meat in market stalls made his stomach churn, not in disgust, but in something far worse. A craving he dared not name. He began avoiding markets altogether, retreating deeper into isolation, afraid of what might happen if the wrong opportunity presented itself. Elias started writing again, filling pages with warnings, diagrams of the asylum's layout, symbols he'd memorized from the basement walls. He mailed copies to newspapers, to priests, to politicians. Most ignored him. A few responded with polite disbelief, but one letter, unsigned, delivered in an envelope sealed with wax, contained only a single sentence. "You think you left us, but you are proof we succeeded." From that moment, Elias stopped trying to convince the world. He understood the truth: the asylum didn't need to keep him locked inside. It had planted itself inside him. The voice in the fog had been right. He had crossed the wall, but he had not escaped. And every day, the hunger whispered a little louder. It was a year after his escape when Elias first saw the signs in the outside world. He had been living in a fishing village on the Massachusetts coast, a place where the salt air could almost cleanse the smell of the asylum from his memory. But then, one evening at the dockside tavern, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A mark carved into the wooden beam above the hearth. It was faint, weathered by years of smoke, but unmistakable. The same geometric symbol he'd seen etched into the asylum's basement walls. He asked the barkeep about it casually, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The man shrugged, saying it was just an old charm, left by the previous owner, some kind of good luck sign. Elias knew better. There was no luck in that symbol, only ownership. From that day forward, he began seeing them everywhere. Scratched into the corner of a butcher's doorframe. Painted faintly on the side of a warehouse near the harbor. Even stitched, almost invisible, into the lining of a beggar's coat. The symbols were subtle, almost hidden, but they were there, and each one sent a shiver of recognition through him. The asylum had roots outside its walls. It wasn't just the symbols. In the market, Elias watched a butcher wrap a package of meat in paper. For a split second, he caught the look in the man's eyes. Not hunger, not pride, but that same dull, glassy stare he'd seen in patients after the rituals. On the street, a dock worker stopped mid-conversation, sniffing the air in a way that made Elias' stomach knot. These people were free, yet something in them was familiar. The realization came like ice water: the asylum was not a single place. It was a network, a doctrine, a quiet infection. Hawthorne's consumption right had not been confined to the desperate and the mad. It had spread past like a secret handshake, a silent initiation. That night, Elias sat in his rented room, staring at the symbol he'd carved into the table with his own trembling hand, not even realizing he'd done it. The hunger rose in him again, sharper this time, more insistent. And for the first time, he wondered if his role wasn't to escape the asylum's reach, but to help it grow. It happened on a rain-soaked night, the kind where the streets glisten like black glass and every shadow seems alive. Elias had been drinking alone in the tavern, trying to drown the hunger that pulsed in his gut. The door opened, and a tall man in a dark coat stepped inside. His presence silenced the room without a word. He moved with a kind of deliberate calm, scanning the faces until his gaze locked on Elias. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. The man crossed the room slowly, the sound of his boots clicking against the floorboards cutting through the muffled rain. He sat across from Elias without asking, his coat dripping onto the floor. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied Elias with eyes that were unreadable, not cold, not warm, but somehow both. Then he spoke in a low voice, so measured it felt rehearsed. "You've been away too long." Elias' throat tightened. He told himself not to answer, not to give this man anything. But the stranger leaned forward, and the faint smell of the asylum's kitchens, the smell of boiled meat, hit him like a blow. "You've felt it, haven't you?" The man continued. "The pull, the hunger. You think it's a curse, but it's a gift. And it's time to stop wasting it." Elias gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. The man slid something across the wood. A folded piece of paper, sealed with the same wax Elias had seen on that ominous letter months before. The seal bore the geometric mark from the asylum's basement, sharp and perfect. "Hawthorne still remembers you," the man said, his voice almost soothing now. "He says you were one of the few who understood. One of the few worth keeping." Elias didn't touch the paper. He wanted to shove it back, to deny everything, but part of him, the part the asylum had carved into, wanted to open it, to see what was inside. The man rose from his chair, buttoning his coat. "Read it when you're ready. We always come back, Elias, one way or another." And then he was gone, swallowed by the rain. The paper sat between Elias' hands like a live thing, pulsing with an unspoken promise. The mapmaker's work was nearly complete. A detailed chart of every room, every tunnel, every shadowed alcove of the Haraway estate. Yet something was wrong. A new section had appeared, drawn in fresh ink, depicting a narrow hallway that no one had ever entered. The cartographer swore he hadn't added it, but when he held the parchment close to the candlelight, faint words bled through from the other side. "You will not return the same." That night, against every instinct, he decided to find the corridor. What he found wasn't stone or wood. It was a space that folded around him, where time twisted and his own reflection whispered in a language his ears couldn't comprehend. He staggered out at dawn, clutching the map, and found his own name scratched in the margins, in a handwriting not his own. It began with a single drop of blood spilled on cold stone, an act so small, so quiet, it could have gone unnoticed. But in the Hollingsworth world, nothing involving blood was ever small, and nothing was ever forgotten. Generations ago, a man of their line swore vengeance against a rival family, vowing that until the debt was paid in full, the Hollingsworths would live not in peace, but in a state of perpetual readiness for war. That promise twisted over time, passing from father to son, mother to daughter, until it was no longer about revenge. It was about maintaining a code, a brutal sense of honor that demanded blood for blood, insult for insult, and betrayal for betrayal. Even the children were taught it before they could read. A debt in blood is written in the marrow. It will be paid. Every act of kindness from the Hollingsworths carried a shadow. Every handshake was measured against an invisible scale of loyalty and offense. If you helped them, they remembered. If you wronged them, they remembered longer. Old ledgers were kept, not of money, but of slights. Whole branches of the family were dedicated to maintaining these records, written in cryptic ciphers only the inner circle could read. Some debts were repaid in simple, almost business-like transactions. Others took decades, the retribution arriving so late that the descendants of the offender had no idea what they were being punished for. To the Hollingsworths, time was irrelevant, a debt was timeless, and they would collect whether the debtor still breathed or had been buried 100 years. But this obsession with balance came at a cost. It made them incapable of forgiveness, incapable of letting go. Feuds festered across centuries, turning neighbors into enemies, and sometimes even splitting the Hollingsworths themselves into factions, each claiming the right to interpret the original blood vow. And yet the code endured, because for the Hollingsworths, the code was not a choice. It was the spine that held the family upright. To break it would be to break themselves. The true horror was not the violence they inflicted on others, but the prison they had built for their own souls. A prison with bars forged from promises made long before they were born, and locks sealed with the blood of strangers who had simply crossed their path at the wrong moment in time. Do you want me to continue with 15 now? You said 10. Here's section 15. Continue in the same intense cinematic tone. The night was unnervingly still. The kind of stillness that feels less like peace and more like something watching you from the edges of the dark. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like a whisper too close to the ear, each groan of the house like something shifting in its sleep. But this was no ordinary night. The air inside the Donnelly estate carried a weight, a thickness, as though it had been holding its breath for generations. Those who dared to step inside swore they could hear faint laughter, the sound of porcelain shattering in the distance, and once, the unmistakable creak of a rocking chair moving on its own. The walls bore stains no scrubbing could remove, long dark streaks that seemed to spread deeper over time, as if the house was bleeding from wounds it refused to heal. Some claimed these marks matched the very places where bodies had fallen, where life had been snuffed out in acts no one dared to put in writing. There were whispers in town of a locked cellar door beneath the kitchen, hidden behind a warped oak panel. The key, they said, had been missing for decades, or perhaps deliberately thrown into the lake to keep what lay inside from ever seeing light again. But locks are only meant to keep out the living. The dead have no need for keys, and if the Donnelly bloodline was cursed, then the curse had long since learned to walk freely between walls, between dreams, between the living and the damned. The rain had not stopped for days, and by the 16th night, the town began to believe it never would. Mudslides carved scars down the hills, and the streets were rivers of black water, carrying branches, dead animals, and the occasional forgotten toy from an abandoned yard. But amid the chaos, the Hollander house stood untouched, its white facade gleaming like bone in the moonlight. No one had dared approach it since the disaster began. They whispered that the family inside didn't need the sun, that the earth itself was feeding them. Windows were open, curtains breathing in the damp wind, but no one could see a single figure moving within. Then came the sound, low, rhythmic, like the wet thud of meat being pounded into the earth. It was a noise that didn't belong to the storm, and those who heard it swore it came from beneath the house, from the soil that had been undisturbed for centuries. And still, the Hollander house remained dry, its floors untouched by water, as if the flood feared what lived there. The walls of the house seemed to sweat that night, a slow, oppressive dampness that made the wallpaper sag like rotting skin. No one had touched the piano in months, yet at precisely 20:47 a.m., the keys pressed down one by one, producing a sound so low and dissonant it felt more like a heartbeat than music. The first to hear it was Margaret, but by the time she rose from bed, the sound had already stopped. In the hallway, the air was colder and she could see her own breath twisting in the dark. That was when she noticed it. The mirror at the far end of the corridor was no longer showing her reflection. Instead, it displayed the image of a stranger, a man with hollow eyes and a mouth stitched shut, standing perfectly still. She blinked, and the glass showed only her again, but she knew what she had seen. In the morning, she told no one. Not because she thought they wouldn't believe her, but because she feared they would, and that would make it real. But as the days passed, more family members began waking at 20:47, hearing that same slow, deliberate pressing of piano keys from an instrument that should have been incapable of sound. The earth beneath the ruins seemed to hum, not with the sound of machinery, but with something far older, a pulse that had been there long before the house was built, and would remain long after it rotted into dust. Some said it was the heartbeat of the land itself, a remnant of a time when blood and soil were bound by a pact no man dared break. Others whispered it was the echo of the children, those who had been taken, those who had been bound, those whose tiny bones now slept beneath the roots. Standing there, you could feel it like a second pulse in your own chest, slow, deliberate, and impossibly deep. Every step closer to the center of that energy made your vision dim, as though the daylight itself recoiled from you. The trees formed a cathedral of shadows overhead, and the wind carried a low, guttural moan that had no source you could see. By the time you reached the clearing, you understood what the family had been guarding all along. It wasn't gold, or land, or even their own lives. It was this secret, this power, this terrible ancient truth they would rather burn alive than let fall into the wrong hands. You look down and see a stone circle, worn smooth by centuries, and realize it is not a marker, it's a seal. And with the weight of the air pressing down upon you, you feel certain of one thing: if it ever breaks, the screams you've heard in your dreams will finally have a mouth to pour from.